I walked into precision shooting range on what I thought would be a quiet Tuesday afternoon, carrying my grandfather's old rifle case like it contained nothing more valuable than yesterday's newspaper. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor, and the smell of gunpowder and metal polish filled my nostrils. I'd been coming here for 3 months now, ever since I'd found Grandpa Joe's Springfield M1A in the attic after his funeral, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth with a note that simply read, "For Emma, when you're ready to understand." What I didn't expect was to walk into what felt like an episode of some testosterone-fueled reality show. 3 men in their 30s clustered around Lane 7, their voices carrying across the range with the kind of confidence that comes from never being challenged. The tallest one, wearing a tactical vest that probably cost more than my monthly rent, was holding what looked like a custom AR-15 with enough modifications to make a Navy SEAL jealous. His name tag read Instructor Blake, though I'd never seen him actually instruct anyone in anything other than his own superiority. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake announced to his companions, his voice dripping with theatrical authority, "we have ourselves a newcomer." His eyes locked onto me with the kind of predatory assessment I'd grown familiar with in my 32 years of existing while female. "And she's brought what appears to be a museum piece." The laughter that followed wasn't the good-natured ribbing you might expect among shooting enthusiasts. It was the sharp, cutting kind that's designed to establish hierarchy, to put someone in their place before they even realize there's a place to be put. I set my case down on the counter at lane 12, deliberately choosing the spot furthest from their little circus, and began the methodical process of signing in. My hands didn't shake, though they wanted to. "Excuse me, miss," called out the second man, this one sporting a perfectly groomed beard and enough tactical gear to outfit a small militia. "You might want to consider starting with something a little more manageable. We've got some nice 22s available for rental. Very beginner-friendly." The condescension in his voice could have been bottled and sold as a cure for overconfidence. I looked up from my paperwork, offering him the kind of smile I'd perfected in boardrooms full of men who thought my MBA was decorative. "Thank you for the concern, but I think I'll manage just fine with what I brought." The third member of their trio, younger than the others but trying desperately to fit in, actually snorted. "Lady, do you even know what you're carrying in that case? That looks like it could be a military rifle. Those things kick like a mule. You could hurt yourself." Here's what they didn't know about me, and what I wasn't about to volunteer. I'd spent the last 3 months not just learning to shoot, but learning to shoot well. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I'd been here with Frank Morrison, the 78-year-old Marine veteran who ran the evening shift. Frank didn't talk much, but when he did, every word carried the weight of experience earned in places where mistakes meant more than bruised egos. He'd taught me that shooting wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about respect, for the weapon, for the target, and for the responsibility that comes with both. But mostly, Frank had taught me that the loudest voices on a shooting range were usually compensating for something. I opened my case with deliberate care, revealing Grandpa Joe's Springfield M1A. The rifle was immaculate, its walnut stock gleaming under the range lights, every piece of metal polished to a mirror finish. It was a weapon that had seen combat in Vietnam, had been maintained with the kind of religious devotion that only comes from understanding its true purpose. The sudden silence from Lane 7 was almost comical. "Holy shit," whispered the bearded man, and for the first time since I'd arrived, his voice carried genuine respect instead of manufactured superiority. "Is that an M1A?" Blake recovered quickly, though I caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Nice restoration piece," he said, his tone now slightly less confident. "Those are great for display. Very historical. But for actual shooting, you really want something more modern. Better accuracy, less recoil, more user-friendly features." I finished assembling my shooting rest and adjusting my position, all while maintaining the kind of calm that Frank had drilled into me during those long evening sessions. "You know," I said conversationally, not looking up from my preparations, "my grandfather always told me that a good rifle doesn't make a good shooter, but a good shooter can make any rifle look good." The comment hung in the air like smoke, and I could feel the shift in attention from the other lanes. Other shooters had begun to notice our little drama, though most were trying to pretend they weren't eavesdropping. I could see them stealing glances, could feel the anticipation building like pressure in a closed system. "Care to make it interesting?" Blake called out, and now his voice carried the kind of challenge that men like him can't seem to resist issuing. "We've got a little competition going over here. 100-yard targets, 10 rounds, best group wins. Winner gets bragging rights, and the loser buys the first round at Murphy's Bar." I finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "What makes you think I'd be interested in your competition?" "Because," he said, his grin spreading like spilled oil, "you've got that look. That I've got something to prove look, and frankly, it would be entertaining to watch." The insult was delivered with surgical precision, wrapped in just enough plausible deniability that he could claim innocence if called on it. But I'd heard variations of this theme my entire adult life. In conference rooms and job interviews and every other arena where men felt threatened by women who refused to apologize for existing. I set down my rifle and turned to face him fully. "You're right about one thing," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet range. "I do have something to prove, but not to you." I could see the confusion flicker across his face, the momentary uncertainty of a man who'd expected either capitulation or obvious anger. Instead, I'd given him something else entirely: dismissal. And for men like Blake, being dismissed was worse than being challenged. "Actually," I continued, loud enough for everyone to hear, "let's make it interesting. But not the way you suggested." I reached into my bag and pulled out a $20 bill, placing it on the counter between us. $20 says I can put 10 rounds into a tighter group at 100 yards than you can. Winner takes the money and the respect. Loser admits they were wrong about what they thought they knew. The range had gone completely quiet now. Even the background hum of the air circulation system seemed to pause. Blake looked at his companions, then at the growing audience of shooters who had abandoned all pretense of minding their own business. His face cycled through several expressions before settling on the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "You're on," he said, adding his own 20 to the pot. "But let's make it more interesting. 50 yards first, then 100. 2 different challenges?" I nodded, knowing exactly what he was doing. By splitting it into 2 challenges, he was giving himself more chances to win and more opportunities to demonstrate his superiority. What he didn't realize was that he was also giving me more chances to make my point. We moved to adjacent lanes, and I began the process of settling into my shooting position. Frank had taught me that shooting was 90% mental preparation and 10% trigger control, though he'd been quick to point out that the 10% was where most people failed. I could feel the weight of attention from the other shooters, could sense the mixture of curiosity and skepticism that radiated from the growing crowd of observers. Blake, meanwhile, was making a show of adjusting his scope and discussing wind conditions with his companions, his voice pitched just loud enough to ensure everyone could hear his technical expertise. "Winds coming from the northwest at maybe 3 miles per hour, he announced. "Temperature's 72 degrees. Humidity looks to be around 40%. That's going to affect bullet trajectory, especially at 100 yards. He was performing now, playing to his audience, demonstrating the kind of knowledge that was supposed to intimidate amateur shooters. What he didn't know was that I'd spent hours studying ballistics, had memorized the performance characteristics of my grandfather's rifle, and had learned to read wind conditions by watching the movement of flags in grass, rather than consulting weather apps. I settled into my position, feeling the familiar weight of the M1A against my shoulder, and began the breathing exercises that Frank had drilled into me until they became automatic. In through the nose, out through the mouth, heart rate slowing, vision sharpening, the world narrowing to nothing but the target downrange, and the delicate relationship between my finger and the trigger. "Ladies first," Blake called out, his voice carrying that particular brand of chivalry that's really just condescension in a bow tie. I didn't respond to Blake's comment, didn't acknowledge the theatrical gallantry that was really just another form of mockery. Instead, I focused on the 50-yard target, a standard bullseye that looked deceptively simple in the range's artificial lighting. Frank had taught me that the key to good shooting wasn't just technical skill, but mental discipline. The ability to block out everything except the relationship between you, the rifle, and the target. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, could sense my breathing settling into the rhythm that Frank had shown me during those quiet evening sessions. The M1A felt like an extension of my body now, familiar and balanced, its weight distributed perfectly across my shooting rest. I'd spent hours getting to know this rifle, understanding its quirks and preferences, learning to read its subtle communications. The first shot broke clean, the recoil rolling through my shoulder with the kind of authority that only comes from a full-power rifle cartridge. I didn't need to look downrange to know it was good. I could feel it in the way the rifle behaved, could sense it in the smoothness of the follow-through. But I did look, using the spotting scope to confirm what my body already knew. The shot had punched through the 10 ring, slightly high and to the right, but well within the target's center zone. I made a minor adjustment to my point of aim and settled in for the second shot. Behind me, I could hear Blake providing commentary to his audience, his voice carrying the kind of professional analysis that was designed to sound impressive. "Not bad for a first shot," he said, though I could detect the slight strain in his voice. "Little high, but that's typical for someone not used to the rifle's characteristics. She'll probably pull the next few shots low as she overcompensates." The second shot proved him wrong, cutting through the air with the same authority as the first, and punching into the target less than an inch from my opening shot. I continued my methodical pace, each shot following the same ritual of breath control, sight alignment, and smooth trigger press. By the time I'd fired my 5th round, I had established a group that could have been covered by a silver dollar. The range had grown progressively quieter with each shot, the casual conversation and equipment noise fading, as more attention focused on our little competition. I could sense the shift in mood, could feel the growing realization among the observers that this wasn't going to play out the way they'd expected. Blake's commentary had become less frequent and more subdued, though he maintained his air of professional expertise. When I finished my 10 rounds, I set the rifle down and stepped back from the line, feeling the familiar mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that comes from sustained concentration. Through the spotting scope, my group looked tight and centered, though I wouldn't know the exact measurement until we retrieved the targets. Blake took his position with considerable ceremony, adjusting his rifle's bipod and scope with the kind of precision that was clearly meant to impress. His AR-15 was an expensive piece of equipment, bristling with accessories and modifications that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. He'd obviously invested considerable money in his shooting hobby, and his movements suggested familiarity with his equipment. His first shot was followed by a satisfied nod, and when he checked his spotting scope, his confidence seemed to return in full force. "Center punch," he announced to his audience. "That's how you start a group." But as he continued shooting, I could see small signs of tension creeping into his performance. His breathing wasn't quite as controlled as it should have been, and I could detect slight variations in his shooting position between rounds. The pressure of public performance, combined with the unexpected challenge I'd presented, was affecting his normally steady technique. By his 7th shot, sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his commentary had stopped entirely. His companions were offering encouragement, but their voices carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there when we'd started. When Blake finished his string, we called a ceasefire and walked down range to examine our targets. The walk felt longer than 50 yards, each step building tension like a slowly wound spring. Other shooters gathered around us, their curiosity overcoming any pretense of politeness. Blake's group was respectable, the kind of shooting that would impress casual observers, and certainly better than average for most recreational shooters. His 10 shots formed a roughly circular pattern about 3 inches across, centered well within the target's scoring rings. It was solid, competent shooting that spoke to genuine experience and skill. But my group was something else entirely. 10 shots clustered within a space that could have been covered by a quarter, forming the kind of precision that usually requires years of dedicated practice. The silence that followed our target examination was profound, broken only by someone's whispered, "Holy shit." Blake stared at my target for a long moment, his face cycling through expressions I couldn't quite read. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. That's very good shooting," he admitted, though the words seemed to cost him something. "Better than I expected." "Thank you," I replied simply, not gloating, not explaining, just acknowledging his grudging compliment with the kind of grace that Frank had taught me was more devastating than any verbal victory. But Blake wasn't finished. Even faced with clear evidence that his assumptions had been wrong, he couldn't quite let go of his need to maintain superiority. "Of course, 50 yards is pretty forgiving," he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier authority. "The real test is at 100 yards. That's where you separate the serious shooters from the casual plunkers." I could see what he was doing, could recognize the psychological strategy of moving the goalposts when the game wasn't going your way. It was a tactic I'd encountered in business, in relationships, and in every other arena where threatened egos needed protection from uncomfortable realities. "You're absolutely right," I said, and I watched his face brighten slightly at what he took for concession. "The 100-yard line will definitely separate us." We moved to the longer range, and I began the process of adjusting my sight settings for the increased distance. The M1A's iron sights were precise but unforgiving, requiring the kind of visual acuity and steady hold that modern optics had largely eliminated from recreational shooting. Blake's rifle, with its high magnification scope and precision adjustments, was clearly designed for this kind of work. As I settled into my new shooting position, I thought about my grandfather and the stories he'd never quite told about his time in Vietnam. I thought about Frank Morrison and his patient instruction during those evening sessions when the range was empty except for us. I thought about all the assumptions that had been made about me from the moment I'd walked through the door, and about the quiet satisfaction of proving those assumptions wrong without saying a word. The 100-yard targets looked impossibly small through my iron sights, reduced to tiny circles that wavered with every slight movement or change in focus. This was where Blake expected me to fail, where the limitations of my equipment and experience would finally reveal themselves. This was where the natural order would reassert itself and normal service would be resumed. I took my time with the first shot, feeling for the perfect balance between sight alignment and trigger control that Frank had shown me represented the essence of rifle shooting. The shot felt good when it broke, rolling through the rifle with the kind of authority that spoke to proper technique and careful preparation. When I checked the spotting scope, the bullet hole appeared exactly where I'd aimed, punched cleanly through the target's center ring. Blake was shooting more carefully now, taking longer between shots and paying closer attention to his breathing and position. His earlier showmanship had been replaced by genuine concentration, and I could see him making small adjustments to his scope between rounds. He was clearly a competent shooter, and his equipment gave him significant advantages in precision and ease of use. But something had changed in the dynamic of our competition, something subtle but unmistakable that affected everything from his shooting rhythm to the way he interacted with his audience. As we both worked our way through the 100-yard challenge, I found myself entering that zone that Frank had described, but which I'd only experienced a few times before. The place where conscious thought disappears and shooting becomes as natural as breathing. Each shot felt inevitable, the rifle seeming to fire itself at exactly the right moment, the recoil rolling through my body without disturbing the perfect stillness that preceded each trigger press. By the time I reached my 8th shot, I knew I was shooting the group of my life. I could feel it in the way the rifle settled, could sense it in the absolute consistency of each shot's execution. The target, impossibly small at this distance, seemed to grow larger with each round, as if the universe was contracting to focus solely on that tiny circle of paper 100 yards away. Blake finished his string first, stepping back from the line with the kind of satisfied expression that suggested confidence in his performance. His shooting had been steady and competent, each shot placed with the methodical precision that comes from good equipment and solid technique. When he checked his target through the spotting scope, his satisfied nod suggested he was pleased with his group. I fired my final 2 shots with the same deliberate care as the previous 8, feeling each bullet's flight as if I were riding along with it downrange. The 10th shot felt perfect when it broke, the rifle recoiling straight back without the slightest deviation from my point of aim. I set the M1A down and stepped back from the line, suddenly aware of how quiet the range had become. When we walked downrange to retrieve our targets, the tension was palpable. Blake's group was impressive. 9 shots clustered within a 2-inch circle, with one flyer that opened the group to about 3 inches overall. It was the kind of shooting that would win competitions at many local ranges, demonstrating genuine skill and familiarity with his equipment. He examined his target with obvious pride, and his companions offered congratulations on what was clearly his best performance of the day. Then we looked at my target, and the silence that followed was profound. 10 shots had punched through the paper in what could only be described as a single, ragged hole. The group measured less than an inch across, with several shots so close together that their bullet holes overlapped. It was the kind of precision that usually required bench-rest rifles and laboratory conditions, achieved instead with a 60-year-old battle rifle and iron sights. Blake stared at my target for what felt like several minutes, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been respect. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "That's not possible," he said, though he was looking at clear evidence that it was not only possible but had actually happened. Iron sights at 100 yards. That group is smaller than most people shoot with scopes at 50. I took the $20 bills from the counter and folded them carefully, not in triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction that comes from a job done well. "My grandfather always said that equipment doesn't make the shooter," I replied, echoing the lesson Frank had drilled into me during those patient evening sessions. He said that respect for the rifle and respect for the fundamentals were worth more than all the gadgets and accessories in the world. The crowd of observers was beginning to disperse, though several shooters approached to examine my target more closely and ask questions about my background and training. I answered politely but briefly, not wanting to turn the moment into another kind of performance. Blake and his companions had moved off to one side, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation, though I couldn't hear what they were saying. As I began packing up my equipment, one of the other shooters, an older gentleman with the bearing of someone who'd spent serious time behind a rifle, approached me with obvious respect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from genuine expertise. "I've been shooting competitively for 30 years, and that's one of the finest displays of marksmanship I've ever witnessed. That's military-grade precision with civilian equipment. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Before I could answer, Frank Morrison appeared at my elbow, having emerged from the range office where he'd apparently been watching the entire proceedings. His weathered face carried the hint of a smile, though his eyes held the same quiet satisfaction I was feeling. "Emma's been working with me for the past 3 months, he said simply. "She's got natural talent, but more importantly, she's got the patience to do things right." Blake overheard this exchange and approached us, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked like genuine curiosity. 3 months? He asked, his voice carrying disbelief. "You've only been shooting for 3 months?" "Seriously shooting," I corrected. I'd done some casual plinking before, but Frank taught me how to actually shoot. I could see Blake processing this information, trying to reconcile it with what he'd witnessed. His entire worldview about shooting, about expertise, about the relationship between equipment and skill, had been challenged in the space of 20 shots. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, and to his credit, his voice carried what sounded like genuine remorse. "I made assumptions about your abilities based on things that don't matter. That was wrong of me." I nodded, accepting his apology without making a show of magnanimity. "We all make assumptions," I replied. "The important thing is being willing to change them when we're proven wrong." As we shook hands, I could see something different in his expression. Not just the acknowledgement of my shooting ability, but recognition of something larger about assumptions and respect, and the dangerous comfort of stereotypes. Frank helped me finish packing my equipment, and as we prepared to leave, he offered one of his rare pieces of direct advice. "You know, Emma," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent teaching people about firearms and responsibility, "today wasn't really about the shooting. It was about respect. Giving it and earning it. You did both." Walking out to my car, carrying my grandfather's rifle case with a new understanding of its weight and significance, I reflected on what had transpired. The $40 in my pocket wasn't really the prize. It was the look of recognition in Blake's eyes when he realized that his assumptions about women and shooting and expertise had been not just wrong, but fundamentally misguided. As I drove home through the late afternoon traffic, I thought about my grandfather and the lessons he'd tried to teach through that carefully maintained rifle. I thought about Frank Morrison and his patient instruction, and about the quiet satisfaction that comes from letting your actions speak louder than any words. But mostly, I thought about the power of earned respect, and the importance of never making assumptions about what someone else is capable of achieving. The next Tuesday, when I returned to the range for my regular practice session, Blake was there waiting for me. This time, instead of mockery or condescension, He approached with genuine respect and a request that surprised me. "Emma," he said, "I was wondering if you might be willing to give me some pointers. I've been thinking about what happened last week, and I realized that all my expensive equipment hasn't taught me what you learned in 3 months with Frank. Maybe it's time I focus more on the fundamentals." I smiled, remembering Frank's words about respect being something that had to be both given and earned, and agreed to help him understand what my grandfather and Frank had taught me, that the most important equipment in shooting isn't what you carry in your hands, but what you carry in your heart and mind.